And welcome to everybody on behalf of the College of Arts and Sciences and the university. I was speaking to my class earlier this week about how we are faring in this pandemic age. And one of the things that came out as a regular theme is the notion that we all feel some sort of loss. We've lost the ability to be in contact with each other physically, to be in the same spaces, to move around with our families. And of course, there's the overwhelming loss of life that's associated with this. But the sort of rosy part of this moment for us is that we get to participate in events like this. This is the 36th Stirnot Lecture at Quinnipiac University. Its history is long and distinguished. It's part of the ways in which we have stood our ground and participated in the intellectual and humanistic conversation about what it means to be a human being in the various ages that we have lived through. And it's especially wonderful to have a guest like Professor Vanessa Wills to join us today. So again, I want to reiterate the fact that this is an important moment where we reconnect via Zoom, obviously, and remotely, but we reconnect with our community, our human community, our college community. And I want to once again welcome all of you and thank the philosophy department, Jen Sacco and Nat Bieletsky, for putting this together. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. So now let me hand the podium over to my colleague, Anat Bieletsky. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bob, for being here with us, for making this both a CAS event, a whole university event, and of course, a philosophy event. As many of you know, the Stirnot Lecture is traditionally one of the first academic events of the year. It's a mark of the contribution of philosophy to a Quinnipiac University education. The Stirnot Lecture has also, perhaps less formally, but still traditionally, definitely in the last several years, become the context in which we connect philosophy, not just to the rest of the campus, but also, more so, to our political, social, economic, real setting and situation. And what year is more fitting than this year to think philosophically about real circumstances, real surroundings, real challenges, and real crises? It was with that thought in mind that we set out to find our Stirnot speaker for this year, and we're proud to say that we've accomplished that objective. Instead of talking about philosophy in real life, I want to say a few words about academics and activism. Vanessa Wills comes to us from the George Washington University, where she's assistant professor of philosophy. But if you read her webpage, not her academic university page, her own webpage, you'll encounter the amazing identities. She's a, quote, political philosopher, ethicist, educator, and activist. Suppose the political philosopher and ethicist are labels of academic expertise, fine. Suppose the educator is a matter of a still academic vision, but you cannot get away from that marker activist, which carries added value to anything that we might do as academics and educators. And that makes her so timely for the Stirnot in these times. Look, though, also at her academic identity. She specializes, we're talking about philosophy here, in moral, social, and political philosophy, in 19th century German philosophy, especially Karl Marx, and in the philosophy of race. We're enticed to play the game of connections here. It seems natural and easy. Moral, social, political, Karl Marx, and race. She tells us herself that that connection is, quote, the ways in which economic and social arrangements can inhibit or promote the realization of values such as freedom, equality, and human development. What could be more apt? Then there is, of course, explicitly her research. Looking at the titles of some of her pieces of research and publications, we come upon, and this is a list, but lists are not what I love making. It's just feeling this list. So we come upon Man is the Highest Being for Man, Marx's Radical Irreligion, or Black Woman Marxists on Race, Gender, and Class, or What Are You Doing Around Here, Trayvon Martin and the Logic of Black Guilt. The white privilege concept in Marxism and critical race theory, racist ideology and false consciousness, bad guys and dirty hands, ethical policing in the presence of racial injustice, or the pretty recent one, what could it mean to say capitalism causes sexism and racism? And then look at the courses she teaches. There are, of course, the to be expected, though still usually rare, philosophy of human nature, or Hegel and post-Hegelian philosophy, or even the philosophy of Karl Marx. But then there are philosophy of fascism and anti-fascism, economic justice, philosophy of race. And speaking of philosophy, my favorite, philosophy as a virtuous irritation. Can there be ruthless criticism in safe spaces? I could go on and on. The list of her academic presentations is my dream list of what I would like our students to hear and ourselves to speak about. Because her research and teaching are themselves the exemplar of activism. Not for naught then does she engage in public writing and speaking. Note recently a blog on Black Lives Matter as identity politics and class struggle, or the oh so current from the lockdown protests to the Capitol. There's nothing more spectacular than to look forward to a talk with bated intellectual and political and moral breath. That is where I find myself now, as I welcome ever so thankfully Vanessa Wills to talk to us about reason, reaction, and Black rebellion. Thank you, Vanessa.
Thank you so much. That has to be one of the maybe the warmest introduction that I've ever had. So thank you so much, and I'm so delighted to be here addressing the audience at Quinnipiac. And I know there are, one of the beauties of Zoom is that we may have audience members from all over the U.S. and perhaps all over the world. So thank you so much for taking some time out of your Friday afternoon to spend time doing philosophy with me. So the title of my talk is Reason, Reaction, and Black Rebellion. And I want to think about the lessons that we should draw from Black liberation struggles in the United States, especially with respect to how the Black radical tradition can help us make sense of far-right authoritarianism today and how to fight it. One of the things that is odd in a way about our current attempts to make sense of the recent events and of the political and social trends that we have seen unfold certainly over the past 4 years, and of course over a longer time frame than that. But especially, these kinds of heightened tensions around race, around politics, around oppression on the basis of any number of identities and so on over the last 4 years, the rise in hate crimes and hate speech, and this kind of political environment that saw this spectacular, right, in the strictly literal sense of this spectacle of expression on January 6th at the Capitol, and which is a moment that really broke into much of our public consciousness and made it, I think, clear to a perhaps even wider range of folks that there is a problem here. And we have got to come to grips with understanding the rise of fascist or fascistic politics and organizing that is anti-democratic and racist in character. The reason that I say it's odd in a way that we should find ourselves seemingly so unawares in a number of ways is that the history of the United States is full of activism, organizing, and theory aimed at confronting exactly these threats and these challenges of racism, of domination, of movements that counter democracy and are against the expression of a mass politics, a politics that would allow for the flourishing of human beings of different races and genders and ethnicities and so on. And one of the most important and central sources of that has been Black organizing throughout the entire history of the United States and preceding that history, right? When we think about slavery and the struggle to abolish it and the history of Jim Crow, and in more recent times, the struggle against mass incarceration in the United States. So when we think about these lessons, what lessons should we draw from this tradition? one of the things that, for me, as is particularly concerning in this moment is just when we should be drawing even more inspiration from this tradition of Black radical activism, we actually, in the aftermath of January 6th, are seeing a kind of pulling away, right, blunting of radical Black demands and forgetting of some of the lessons of just even the summer. So of course, what preceded the events at the Capitol, what preceded even the lockdown protests throughout the summer that led to this spectacular event at the Capitol, we have, of course, Black Lives Matter activism, protesters spilling out into the streets in rebellion against a police state, in rebellion against the conditions and the power apparatus of power that produces something like the truly disgusting murder of George Floyd in plain view over a purported bad $20 bill, right? And so this is a kind of spark that lights this huge fire of protest and anger in the streets. And of course, that itself doesn't come out of nowhere, but itself out of a long tradition of Black Lives Matter activism and anti-racist activism. One of the central demands of the Black Lives Matter activism of the summer was to defund the police or abolish the police. And something that I want to highlight here is the way that this demand links together a demand for racial justice with a class demand, because the defund demand was to remove funding from these heavily over-militarized, bloated police departments and fund instead various kinds of social programs. So to add to our list of crises, right, especially crises that disproportionately are affecting people of color and people of various marginalized identities and social positions, I of course don't have to remind anyone here that there is the COVID-19 pandemic, right? So some of the demands were to, instead of funding the police to murder people over, really petty infractions, instead, what if that funding was used in order to allow people the resources that they need to stay home and stay safe and stop the spread of COVID-19? What if we funded education? What if we increased access so that people could have excellent Wi-Fi and the resources that they need in order to continue their studies, so on and so forth, right? And so we see this really kind of radical vision being presented by this tradition of Black organizing, which itself is linked to an abolitionist tradition that draws its inspiration from earlier movements, including the movement to abolish slavery, right? So this long kind of abolitionist politic that comes out of Black organizing and Black freedom struggle. So I say that there's been a kind of moving away from this, right? Over the summer, I think these ideas, they were certainly put forward into the mainstream. All of a sudden, this demand of police abolition, which had been relatively little known, even among sort of left organizing, was a relatively sort of outsider view. All of a sudden, it is part of the mainstream discussion. But already in the summer, we saw a kind of movement to defend policing, right? So when we talk about comments from both Trump and Biden citing the need to prosecute the anarchists, right? And that comes from this awareness that there is an essential connection between Black freedom struggle and left organizing, right? Between the conditions that are necessary in order for Black people to be free and the conditions that are necessary to have freedom for human beings in this country and in others in general, right? And a desire to use the police for their sort of traditional role, which is to break and frustrate exactly that kind of connection. So whether it's the abolition of slavery, organizing against Jim Crow, organizing against mass incarceration, Black people in the US have consistently had to combat and confront white capitalist terror, right? Have constantly had to push back against terror that is meted out, whether on the basis of white supremacy, or on the basis of just the sort of buying and selling of bodies, right? This domination and control that is designed in order to support and uphold, maintain, re-entrench racial capitalism, right? A racial capitalist order. So now, right, is certainly not the time to stop listening. The reason that this is important to say is that I think in response to the unrest, the disturbance, the discomfort, the fear, right, that many of us feel in the face of events like what took place at the Capitol, we think, well, maybe what we need is more policing, more FBI surveillance, and so on. But I think the history of Black organizing tells us a bit about what path that is likely to lead down. And it's not a path away from far-right authoritarianism. So that's one major piece, right, of what I want to talk to you about today. Another theme that I want to bring into conversation with this is this question: what is the political character of reason? And especially, what is the political character of reason in the context of conflicting social interests? That's, of course, for philosophers, that is already an extremely fraught and complex question right on its face, because who's to say that reason has a political character at all? We often think of reason as being perfectly neutral. Perhaps we think of reason purely in the context of instrumental reason. So we think, well, we have this aim or that one, this value or that value, and the purpose of reason is simply to allow us to carry out aims that themselves may or may not be derived from any kinds of intrinsically rational premises. So there's a tradition of, well, not only is there a tradition of Marxist thought, but the tradition of Marxist thought holds that reason is in fact not neutral. That reason itself, right, points us toward theorizing the conditions that are necessary in order to safeguard the continued existence of human beings on the planet at all. And that if human existence is going to continue, just bare existence of human beings on the planet, right, that we will have to organize our lives and organize the ways that we produce and reproduce all of our conditions of existence in a very different way from what we do now. And I think there's perhaps moments in history where that may have seemed like a much wilder claim, but I think it's increasingly clear that it's a claim that has to be taken very seriously, especially when we think, for example, about the role of climate change, right? Which I think is actually one of the clearest arguments in favor of radical reimagining of how human beings live together on the planet. So, okay, so I've talked about this notion that reason might just be this neutral kind of tool, right, or this neutral activity or process. And then I told you that Marxists tend to deny that claim and tend to think that rational thought, that the doing philosophy, doing science, doing history, that all of these things lead us to certain conclusions about how human beings ought to live together if we want to keep living at all. But they're not the only ones who think that reason has a kind of an inherently political character. This thought actually occurs in quite a bit of foundational fascist theorizing and fascist thought, and especially fascist critiques of communism and Marxism. Critique is probably, as I said, critique, I think maybe that's too charitable, actually, sort of fascist slander or attacks, right? So when we look at fascist theorists like Carl Schmitt, like Giovanni Gentile, or even just the comments of someone like Mussolini or Hitler, we find this through line. And the through line is that reason ought to be cast aside, that reason is limited, that reason itself might be misleading, and that what we ought to put in its place is instinct. And what's even better than our own individual instinct is the instinct of a great man, right? The instinct of a leader. And so when we think about some of Trump's own commentary, right, and some of Trump's own rhetoric, where he says things like, well, the scientists, they couldn't believe how well I understood this science. I've never studied it. I just have a feel for it, right? Or when he casts himself as just having hunches and instincts and feelings and suspicions that those who follow him ought to simply place their trust in and go wherever it is that he's leading, right? That is not just his own individual hubris and arrogance. It is something that figures into a long tradition of fascist irrationalism, hatred of reason. And this connects up with other aspects of some ideology that I'm going to talk about right now, presently. So we have the rise of QAnon conspiracy theory. And not just QAnon conspiracy theory, there's, especially when we think about the context of this very moment of the past year of the pandemic. So one thing that is curious is that this conspiracy theory has been around for a few years. So I'm speaking to you now from Washington, D.C., where Comet Ping Pong, a pizza restaurant and music venue, has had to endure several years now, right, of conspiracy theories, of, there was an actual violent attack that took place there. But in the past year, its QAnon conspiracy theory has blown up, much more popular, has much more adherents than it had previously. And there's a number of theories as to why that might be. People are home, right? They're home, they're bored, they're isolated, they're depressed, and they're on social media more than they might have been previously. So there's all these kinds of circumstantial, situational factors that may be a part of this. And it's not just QAnon, right? So we have anti-vaccine rhetoric, which again has been growing for quite a while, but sees this resurgence, right? This kind of huge boon of popularity this year in the context, of course, of a viral pandemic as we seek vaccines, as vaccines were developed and so on. And the anti-vaccine movement gave rise to anti-maskers now, right? And so the question is, why am I listing these things? Like, what do these things have in common? And one thing they have in common, a real kind of antipathy towards science, right? And positing their own kinds of pseudo reasonings. So with the anti-vaccine and anti-masking, right? These, sort of nonsense theories about supposed dangers of the vaccines and the masks. That is also, I think, combined with, and this is something I won't say as much about in the talk, but I'm happy to talk about in Q&A. Another piece of anti-vaccine and anti-mask ideology is that it is inherently antisocial, right? So it is opposed to a kind of social, collective, and collaborative response to crisis. And it's often very conscious, self-consciously so, right? So this idea of, well, I have, individual rights and I don't care what happens to society. Anyway, so the question is, how does any of this exemplify the essential role of irrationalism in far-right authoritarian movements? And of course, my argument is that QAnon today stands in the same reactionary and irrationalist tradition that these earlier forms of far-right extremist irrationalism do, right? A QAnon conspiracy theory is, even though it has a new name and some new delivery systems, we have 8chan now, right? And these kinds of online spaces, it stands in that same tradition. It is nonsense mixed together with some very old anti-Semitic tropes. So why does it have this kind of appeal? Or what function does it play? So I mentioned, that one thing that's going on is people are home, they're bored, but of course lots of people are home, right? But so what else is going on here? So the material, I think it's important to note that there is a kind of materialist basis, right? And this is something that is important for understanding all kinds of ideology. What is the phenomenon that people are experiencing or noticing that this theory, this ideology, however reactionary, irrational, racist, and misguided, is somehow offering some kind of explanation of, an answer to? And I think the material basis for a lot of this QAnon conspiracy theory is the widespread and not actually false or inaccurate sense that we are out of control, that there are forces outside of our control that are operating on us somehow, shaping our world, shaping our life chances, that we as individuals do not have the kind of power, ability, freedom, and opportunity to intervene in and help direct that we would like. And that is necessary in order for people to feel that they are free, right? And that they are in control of their lives and that they are living a kind of fully realized human existence. So there's this feeling of like lack of control and sense that there are plans and there are people making decisions and choices that affect me, but I don't have any ability to intervene, and they're unaccountable. That is a very widespread feeling. And I think it is a feeling that's perfectly understandable. and QAnon conspiracy theory, it offers people an answer, right? It says, well, here's what's going on, right? But instead of offering a real analysis of the problem, it just offers, fantastical nonsense and racism, right? That's what it gives us instead. So when we think about the role of this kind of irrationalism, together with this sort of long-standing history and of terrorism, right, of white terror, of capitalist domination, and we have a kind of collection, right, of explanatory factors, right, that help us to think about how these current present phenomena fit into a larger dynamic, right, an understanding of what is happening in the U.S., but also it's worth noting that QAnon has become increasingly popular globally, and also that anti-mask and anti-vaccine measures and anti-lockdown protests occurred not just in the US, but globally as well, right? From very early on, you saw similar dynamics across Europe, for example. But thinking about, this case of looking at the US as our kind of case under specific analysis here, this question, okay, well, if that's what's going on, how do we confront it, right? What do we do about it? So we know, for example, that the attackers at the Capitol building, that they were attacking liberal democracy, they were attacking the institutions of US rule. They, of course, they literally attacked the Capitol building, and they specifically were there to frustrate the Electoral College count. So as people in the United States, as we grow newly aware of the threat posed to democracy by this kind of far-right extremism, right, and see its growing appeal, right, its capacity to destabilize and society and make us feel quite unsafe and targeted. And it's worth saying that, the us here, right, is everybody, including white people, right? So Black people are always feeling threatened and imperiled by this kind of reactionary white terrorism. That's our normal mode of existence. What is abnormal and notable was that that should be made more general so that white liberals are also feeling quite uneasy and uncomfortable, not just on a level of moral rejection of the politics and aims of these far-right extremists, but also actually feeling a kind of subjective discomfort and fear, right, that they might be attacked. And this is what comes about as a result, right, of the symbolism of the Capitol building being under attack. So in response to that, right, we see this temptation to close ranks around a kind of patriotic American identity. And we hear that in, so I think of this as the America is already great response, right? Which is, which already, of course, had an expression in Hillary Clinton's, right, kind of response to Trump, right, countering his Make America Great Again message with, well, America's already great, right? So we see this response, America's already great. The Electoral College is a sacred institution. Maybe we see this in outrage at the seditiousness, right, of the attack, or in the insurrectionary aims, right, of the attack that are seen as inherently immoral because they challenge the hallowed sacred status of US liberal democratic institutions. It's worth noting here, right, the Electoral College, for example, is so I have a joke about this, right? I say that, the Electoral College is a racist, anti-democratic institution, and these attackers were mad that it wasn't racist and anti-democratic enough, right? And so we need to be able to oppose that kind of attack, right? That kind of racist, anti-democratic attack on these institutions of liberal democracy without ourselves ignoring the fact that the institutions are still quite problematic, right? Although for reasons that are different from the complaints that, the Proud Boys have, for example. It doesn't mean we suddenly just stop acknowledging, right, that there is need for critique here. And so precisely that nationalism, right, that kind of nationalist patriotic response, it has historically been defined in terms that excluded Blacks, right? Remember, I'm talking about this tradition of Black freedom struggle that goes back to the struggle against slavery, right? When we talk about the origins of this kind of nationalist American identity, of the hallowed status of the citizen of this liberal democracy, right? This is a nationalism that has historically been defined in terms that excluded Blacks, right? That required massive expenditure of Black effort, Black struggle, Black blood, right, spilled in order to make it a little bit more expansive to allow for the existence of Black people as members of this polity. And so, but historically, that nationalism has been defined to resist precisely that kind of inclusion. And it has itself laid the groundwork for some of the most virulent forms of racism and reaction. Radical Black activism has always been considered dangerous, immoral, and even seditious. The civil rights movement involved a lot of technically illegal activity. I think we sort of forget this. We politely forget this, right? As I mentioned, Black people, it's not just when we talk about slavery, but all the way through the civil rights move through the 60s, right, until this was challenged by the civil rights movement. We have Black people not considered full citizens. And so, and with all of the harm that Black people in this country face, not just so there's the harm that Black people face, right? And then there's also, on top of that, the harm that is done by US foreign policy around the world, right? That Black people and people of color, and people who are discriminated against on the basis of their ethnicity, on the basis of religion, when we talk about Islamophobia. That we see the U.S. There's bombs. The U.S. has just started bombing Syria today, right? So the U.S. creates all this harm, right? That is disproportionately borne by people of color and people who are marginalized on the basis of their identities around the world. And this is something that Black people in the U.S., right, see as well, right? So we're harmed by this country, and we see the harm that's being done around the world, and then there's this ask that we be patriotic, right? That we perform this love of country, and so there is this kind of liberal response to the threat of far right fascism, right, or fascistic or proto-fascist, right, kinds of organizing and politics that then takes the form of a requirement for a certain kind of affective posture, where the price of being allowed to exist as a citizen of the United States is to show this performative love, right, of a country that hates you. And that is very clear in its hatred of you, right? That's that. So this insistence on patriotism, and especially this kind of like, really this love, this sense that it's all sacred and hallowed and above reproach, right? This insistence on that kind of patriotism as a moral value, it's anti-Black, and it legitimizes imperialism. And it is a failure to embrace the kind of international organizing that is going to be the precondition to freedom for anyone, right? And for and for the the flourishing and continued life of the human species in general. So we can't counter the far right's tall tales by positing instead some equally mythological liberal fantasy. One reason why is that it's clearly false, right? When you say America's already great, people know that that's not what their lives, that is not their lived experience, right? So people are not so easily fooled. People have this experience of not having control, of feeling that they are not confirmed in their existence, that they are under stress, that they are constantly struggling and scraping for the most basic necessities. People are not going to be easily fooled by simply telling them that actually everything's fine. And that kind of narrative, right, that everything is already great, it does, one of its biggest failings is that it actually does a much worse job of making sense of people's material reality and lived experience than the fascist explanations do. Because they at least acknowledge that people are living in what seems to be a state of emergency, right? They offer racist, nonsensical, destructive, irrationalist pseudo explanations for that reality. But they do not turn, right, to masses of, white, poor and working class people and tell them actually everything's already fine and I don't understand what you're so upset about, right? They say, I understand why you're so upset and I'll tell you what the problem is, right? So you cannot counter that with a kind of refusal to see what is plain, right? That there is a problem, that we need a radically different kind of world. So before I conclude, I want to take a few minutes to tell you a little bit about one figure that I find particularly productive to think about, right, in this context. So I want to tell you about someone named Claude Lightfoot. So Claude Lightfoot is the author of a book named Racism and Human Survival. He was a Black organizer, anti-fascist activist, member of the Communist Party. And when the Smith Act, so the Smith Act is the law that makes it illegal to attempt to overthrow the US government. And the Smith Act had been written in a way that was relatively narrow in this in the application of this prohibition, right? So the Smith Act initially was written so that individuals who were accused of attempting to overthrow the US government by force or violence were in violation, right, of this law. But the Smith Act was then expanded so that the new interpretation made it technically in violation of the Smith Act merely to be a member of the Communist Party, right? So merely to be a communist was now considered a seditious act. I think it's not an accident, right, that the first person to be tried and convicted of violating the Smith Act was this Black communist, right, Claude Lightfoot. The conviction was eventually appealed to the Supreme Court after it took 6 years from the time of his conviction in 1955 until he was eventually acquitted in 1961, right? So of course this is in the midst of McCarthyism. That, you know, that's, so as I say, I don't think it's an accident, actually, right? That that it's a Black communist that is the first person to be considered, you know, seditious, right? And when we sort of rally around this skepticism of radical organizing, skepticism of organizing that is asking for a fundamental reshaping of American society, right? We are going to end up playing into a kind of historical narrative that is directly at odds with all kinds of Black organizing that we generally claim to support, right? You know, whether it's the kinds of organizing that helped to overthrow Jim Crow, that helped to overthrow slavery, right? All of that challenged American society in a way that puts it in the crosshairs, right, of this kind of building up of the police state, building up of this kind of state apparatus that criminalizes all kinds of activism and organizing. And you know, whether it's this case that I'm telling you about now, but of course, you know, this is common, right? When we talk about prosecuting the anarchists, right? We can talk about this more in Q&A. But of course, you know, in Black Lives Matter protesting, we saw this police response that was organized in order to target, right, specifically this kind of left-wing organizing and activism. So I'll say a few things here to conclude. And I'm going to wrap this up pretty briefly, and then we'll get into the discussion, which I'm looking forward to. So my point, right? Radical Black politics in the US have never had this luxury of retreating into a kind of liberal fantasy of this being a shining, flawless, perfect example of human democratic fellowship. That has never been on the table as an option for Black people to retreat into and understand as in any way an accurate assessment of the situation that we're in. Black people have always had to fight on two fronts. We have always been on the front lines, bearing the brunt of illiberal, fascistic terror, right? Simultaneously, Black struggle has had to articulate its own ruthless criticisms, unflinching criticisms of liberal politics that fall very short as theory and practice that can meaningfully confront this kind of terrorism, right? This kind of brute domination. So what I've attempted to do here today, right, is to outline some ways that radical Black thought has made these really rich and invaluable contributions historically to a critical and objective understanding of the world and to the project of defending genuine democracy today and tomorrow. And we neglect, quash, and silence it at our great peril, right? And I think that that is the lesson of the moment and the lesson of the history of Black struggle as it has manifested throughout the history of the United States, and in conversation with how we think about all kinds of liberation struggles globally. So thank you so much for having me. And I am greatly looking forward to your questions and thoughts into the conversation. Thank you.
I can clap my hands and assume that everybody else is clapping. I see comments, people saying thank you and fantastic. And if we were in the Mount Carmel auditorium, we would probably be standing and clapping. I am trying to have my hands clapping without everybody saying my eyes tearing, because I think you've said some things that are great challenges to the way we've been thinking and discussing what is going on right now. Let me just say that the questions have been coming in, and I would like to just read one comment here, which is not a question, but is so wonderfully put. This is from Don Colombe Lipa saying, I really love the idea that this is the moment to embrace the idea that America can and needs to do better for all of her citizens. As a white woman, it has been very eye-opening to experience the lack of safety that Black people have lived with, and really just a fraction of what they have felt for so long. I think that is a very fitting comment to add on right now. I'm not going to categorize the questions. I'm going to start in order, even though some of these questions came up pretty much at the beginning of your talk. So perhaps you have answered parts of them. But let me just start and we'll see where the conversation takes us, because I see questions coming in now that are exactly appropriate for the end of the talk. All right, so let's start with the beginning, nevertheless, from Danny Steinsaltz. How important do you think it is for white people to stand up against racism?
Oh, yeah, great question. So it is extremely important, extremely important. So, one of the tragic realities of racism is that it is designed to marginalize and sort of corral people into small collections of folks who have a relatively limited power, right, in and of themselves. And now, with that in mind, the history of Black struggle in the United States becomes all the more heroic, right? When you think about, this relatively small minority within the greater context, of the U.S. population that has mostly been left alone to try to protest, its own oppression and its own sort of conditions of super exploitation. In order to actually create a world where fighting racism is not just a kind of Sisyphean task, that is going to require mass struggle, which of course in the US is going to mean lots and lots and lots of white people, right, are going to have to get on board. And this is one of the things, that is interesting also in the context of the anti-racist protests of the summer, because there was some kind of debate. Well, how much of this is specifically just about George Floyd and anti-racism, and how much of this is people, saying, well, we're opposing other things, so we're protesting for better unemployment benefits, or protesting for PPE, right, and I think that that's the wrong question, right? I think that if you have masses of people who are saying, hey, this is the movement that I should join and get involved in, that is going to, that can grow to meet all of these different kinds of challenges, that can exactly be the kind of basis for a multiracial struggle. One thing I didn't mention in the talk, and I'll say briefly now, and then I'll conclude my answer to this question, but one thing that we don't say enough about is that the Black Lives Matter protest itself was preceded by a condition where the United States was seeing the most wildcat strikes across the country that it had in decades, a massive uptick in working class struggle. Whether it was public transit workers, nurses, doctors, we had the strike of Instacart workers, right, and so on. So that was already there, and I think that's the kind of thing that can draw lots of people right into struggle. So there was always this kind of interaction here, this connection of anti-racist struggle with also a broader struggle, to live. We all want to live. We want to flourish. We want to survive, right? Yeah.
Thank you. So that really goes to the next question. Why do you think the title of the movement, Black Lives Matter, was so aggravating for people who believe that all lives matter? And this speaks exactly to what you're saying, but I think you could perhaps answer that explicitly. And it has an addition here. Do you think it was race related or just people wanting everyone's identities to be thought of? This is an anonymous person, so I can't credit them. But,
yeah. Yeah, so I'll answer this question. I also have a piece that's coming out in a forthcoming volume from Oxford University Press, and it's called the Movement, Philosophy and the Movement for Black Lives is the name of the volume. And my piece in it is And He Ate Jim Crow, Race Thinking as False Consciousness. So that says, and that's largely about this question of Black Lives Matter. So that's a place for, when it's out, that's a place for a more detailed response. But I think one of the things that is disruptive about the very claim that that Black Lives Matter is that it is inherently rebellious because we live in a society where it's obviously false. So it's obviously not true that Black Lives Matter in America. And it's obviously not true when we look at life outcomes, the circumstances of people's health, of their life expectancy, and this has been put onto even greater display as we watched this pandemic disproportionately affect people of color, right? So it's obvious, right? It's obvious if we look at the huge wealth gap, right, between Black people and whites. It's clear, it's clear if we look at how easily the courts and the police throw Black lives away, right? It's just very obvious that the claim is, strictly speaking, inaccurate, right, as a description of the world that we're in. So even to say Black Lives Matter, right, it's already, if it's not a statement of that it merely describes the reality we're in, then what is it? It's obviously aspirational, right? It's obviously aspirational, agitational, right? Revolutionary, even, because we would have to transform this country and this world, right? Unimaginably so, if we were to make it the case that Black lives actually mattered. And I think that's what drives people up the wall, right? That's what is threatening, because if you think Black lives matter, then what are you going to do in order to make it the case that they actually matter, not just as a moral aspiration, but in political fact?
Thank you. I'm going to Mordechai Gordon's question. Isn't there a danger in calling the vision and activism radical, since it feeds into the conservative rhetoric, and moreover, some of the changes that are being advocated for by the Black Lives Black Lives Matter protesters are not radical at all, but rather reflect common sense democratic values. So there's a double question in here about the rhetoric and how it can be used. And then, of course, the essential question, if this is really radical,
Yeah,
obviously it's been called radical and you've said it's radical, but is it really radical?
Yeah, I love this question. So, is there a danger? Yes, right. And I think radical activists, people who have called themselves radical, have felt that danger, have experienced that danger, right? Have whether it is the danger of being sort of sidelined and dismissed and silenced, or the danger of actually being targeted as a radical and murdered, right, and attacked, right, and experiencing, having your house burned down, right. So there absolutely is a danger of identifying as a radical, as saying that you're putting forward radical politics. It can draw this kind of alarmed response, right. And I hear in the question the thought, well, doesn't this just kind of fan the flames of right-wing reaction that says, like these are radicals, right? So I think there is the first danger that I mentioned, right? The danger of sort of, putting a target on your back of a certain kind. I think the danger of inflaming the right or giving them credibility, I actually don't think that that's very much of a danger, because they will call anybody a radical, right? This is one of and we saw that, Obama's a communist, right? According to these same folks. So I don't think that there's any degree of accommodationism that is going to neutralize that kind of concern of people on the far right, sort of using any kind of even moderately liberal expression as a kind of foil, right? I wouldn't worry too much about that. But then, yeah, there's the other question here of, is it in fact radical? And so I want to say, what does it mean to call something radical? I used the word radical many times, and I owe everyone a definition, right, of what that means. And when I say radical, I mean it the way that Marx meant it. And Marx wrote that when we say radical, we talk about going to the root of the problem, right? Radical comes from the Latin word for root. And so to say that it is a radical politics, or that we are drawing on what has historically been referred to as a radical Black tradition, is to say, there is a problem at the root of our society, that this is not the sort of thing that can be dealt with mere tweaks or window dressings. It might not even be the sort of thing that can be solved by just sort of, safeguarding the sanctity of the Electoral College, right? This is something that really requires us to be much more fearless, expansive, and imaginative in how we address the causes, right? What is it that is producing, right, these kinds of inequities and inequalities and dehumanizations?
Thank you. This is not about me. I just want to say that I remember the first time I was ever interviewed somewhere, this must be 30 or 40 years ago, somebody asked me, the interviewer asked me, what does it mean to be a radical leftist? And I do remember what I said. It doesn't matter what I said then. But of course, my mother's friends all called up at her because of this radicalism. I mean, That is what frightens people.
I'll just say quickly, I think oftentimes, when we hear radicalism, we think of just like being the most extreme or something, right? And sort of extremeness for the sake of being extreme. But that's, that I think is really a kind of, it's a kind of, a slander, honestly, of a certain kind, right? And that's not how radicals have themselves, right, explained what it is that they're doing, right? The idea is that we want to talk about the causes, we want to talk about the sources of these problems. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to go to a question that is a little more, call it philosophical for a moment, and then we'll go back to the struggles, to many questions here about the struggle. But William Dean asks, at the core, would you say your first principles are rooted more in Marxism or Black identity?
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, I think that, I'm going to, I want to give an answer that will be more satisfying to the asker, but I think I just have to give what the person who asked this question will probably find deeply unsatisfying, which is to say that I don't think these things can actually be separated and distinguished. I mean, so one thing to think about is that they're not even clearly distinguished in Marx, right? Marx himself wrote about the history of slavery, right? Wrote about the necessity of overthrowing slavery in the United States. Wrote these open letters to Abe Lincoln. Wrote open letters to white workers in the United States, telling them that they needed to support the struggle against the enslavement of Black people. That they would never be free, right? He says, labor in the white skin cannot be free so long as labor in the Black is branded, right? So I think, even we can trace it all the way back, and even for Marx himself, there's not this kind of clean distinction, right, between a kind of Marxist theory or Marxist politic and a struggle for Black liberation. So I really see these things as being, very intrinsically linked together.
Oh, that's so interesting for me because as teachers, we're always trying to categorize things and put them in the right place. And indeed, we've been hearing lately all the time the question whether this is a matter of class, of course,
Yes.
or race or gender. And we're constantly, and we know the wonderful words that put them all together. But these kind of questions raise the question of even the justification for such clear categorizations. And do we want to continue with those categorizations? And I love the way you put Marx here, at least in both camps. I don't know what we would say about him in gender, anti-Semitism. We've got the very interesting stuff that he does. So Marx is a wonderful route here to go over.
Yeah, and it's interesting even with gender, in the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels write that the real point aimed at here is to do away with women's oppression, and they really put that forward as one of the most important aims, right, of a communist movement, right? And when we talk about Marx with respect to anti-Semitism, we have things like on the Jewish question, which is the place, that people think about, of course, for this question, but also there's the context that he is arguing against other people in his milieu to tell them we have to be supportive of the rights of Jewish people. We have to oppose, this kind of like marginalization. So there's a lot of kind of like richness and complexity and sources for thinking through various kinds of oppression. Yeah, but it's complex in exactly the way that you're raising. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Let's go to some questions that are, I'm not going to say more practical, but definitely bring us down to earth again. Sean Duffy says the following: I'm struck by the potential application of the framework you are laying out, the fascist anti-reason approach versus liberal nationalism, that might help us understand the attraction of a Donald Trump to marginalized groups. Some evidence exists that seems to demonstrate a larger support for Trump in 2020 than in 2016 among Black and Latino men. I wonder what you might say about this.
Yeah, so I think that's exactly right. That it is there. So we try to understand this purely through appeals to identity, but we have to think about it in context, where the question is, what is the actually offered alternative? And the actual alternative on the table is Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. Biden, as we all know, right, major architect of the crime bill, spent the whole summer talking about how, he was going to prosecute anarchists, talking about increasing funds for police at the same time that we see these defund demands gain steam and gain momentum. And Kamala Harris, of course, we know her history as a prosecutor, right? And so, I think that in order to draw any kinds of real conclusions, we would want to see what it looks like if you have a candidate who is actually offering the kinds of things that people of color care quite a lot about, like, for example, mass incarceration, right? Like, for example, universal health care, $15 an hour, right? Things of that nature. Now, that I'm not saying that's the whole explanation. We would, some of those folks, including some of those people of color who voted for Trump, may well have voted for Trump because because they're reactionaries too, right? Because that happens, So I'm not saying that that's the full explanation, but I am saying that the particular situation we have right now is a political environment that is so rarefied that it really is not useful for telling us a whole lot about what people will support.
Well, that leads to the next one, exactly what you just said. From Mary Paddock, your presentation of the defund the police argument is very cogent and persuasive. Still, many see the alternative as a world without law, order, and security. How do you respond to those fears?
Yeah, so one of the things here, thank you for this question, because it really goes to, I think, to the importance of engaging with this history of Black radical thought, right? Because one thing that happened in terms of the discourse around defund the police or abolish the police is that it very quickly it became this kind of certainly in white liberal conversations that I was kind of seeing, or maybe even being a kind of cringing participant in certain ways. These people, they just came up with that. This is just some kind of like knee-jerk instinctive response, abolish the police, but nobody actually means abolish the police because that would be crazy, right? But of course, that's not true, right? The defund the demand came out of a long history of activism. And I mentioned in the talk, this abolitionist tradition going back to slavery, but its more recent roots, in the work of somebody like Angela Davis, with her work on prison abolition, which creates a lot of the kind of theoretical framework for thinking about police abolition. People like Ruth Wilson Gilmore, with her book Golden Gulag, and the amazing work that she's done, to lay out a very clear, careful, beautifully researched, resourced, and argued, right, theory about the necessity for an abolitionist program, or work like Alex Vitale's The End of Policing, right? There's a great deal of theory and work that's been done, and all of it ties the demand for abolishing the police for also working towards abolishing the circumstances that produce much of the need, much of the felt or perceived anyway need for police. And when we talk about police, we're talking, about this institution of modern day policing, right? While there may be need, right, for a way to respond, of course, to individual circumstances of violence, right? What we don't need is anything that looks anything like the current apparatus that we have here. And so that goes beyond reformism to, again, that radical, right, to the root, right? Going down to the root causes of why we have this kind of system. And so the abolition demand, it goes hand in hand with demands for things like more money for social workers, right? Housing for people, and meeting people's material needs, right, in a way that we know is highly correlated with less violent crime. And then a huge amount of what goes on in policing is policing stuff that really doesn't need to be policed at all, right? Just kind of this manufacture of misdemeanors and felonies and this whole ecosystem of ways to get Black people in jail, and so that's what it's this two-pronged approach of both meeting people's needs so that they are able to have lives that are more enjoyable and don't bring them into constant conflict, right, with people around them, or they're not having to run afoul of the law in order to meet their basic needs, right, together with just not over criminalizing people for no reason except for collecting fines from them, right?
I'd add to that one small thing. The police departments in several places in the United States have been getting training, have been sending police to be trained in Israel by the Israeli military. And there's a group here in the United States called Jewish Voice for Peace, who are radical, if you want to use that word, who are saying to the police, and this is reform rather than really abolishing the police, but saying you don't want the police to be training to be more militarized rather than more civic policing, which is something completely different.
Exactly.
So there's different angles of looking at this policing and what we want from policing. So thanks, Mary. All right. Jen, I see you wanting to answer Marcus's question. Did you put that up? Is Jen up there?
I'm here, and I wanted Dr. Willis to answer, and she did. I was just flagging it. Sorry.
Okay, so let's just put up Marcus's question. We'll just make it clear, but you did answer it. But
Okay.
we can just emphasize it again. Wait, where is it? It was in front of my eyes a second ago. Oh, Jen, somebody took it off. All right. So we will write out that question for Vanessa, but you have answered it. Yes.
Okay, great.
Let's go to Ceylan, Haktan Ceylan. Hi, I'm glad you're here. So what we got, we have students participating here as well as faculty. Thank you so much. So thank you so much for presenting. Would you contend that modern philosophers hold a particular responsibility in both their philosophical work and general outlooks towards tackling societal issues towards ensuring racial and social justice? Or is it more of a political consideration? Again, wonderful presentation.
Thank you. And is it, so I have a couple answers to this question. One is an annoying philosophy type of answer, which is that, I think everyone has a responsibility to think about the world in a way that tackles these social issues. So it's going to follow directly from that modern philosophers do too. But that's not the question that you're probably asking. And in terms of, philosophy itself as a discipline, as a subject, I think that I wouldn't say that philosophers as such, regardless of what work they're doing and what kind of subfield in philosophy they're doing, have an obligation to, sort of like, to center these issues in their work. There's going to be certain areas of philosophy where it's going to be seem sort of tacked on, right, in a way to do that. But, thinking about those of us who do value theory, I think that if you are thinking of yourself as a moral and or social and or political philosopher, you better, right? It's hard. I think that, that absolutely has to be a central part of the project, right? And has to be something that people are conversant in. And it's amazing to me how far you can go as an ethicist and never think, it doesn't, and even if it's not specifically anti-Black racism, right? But, not think about any kind of not think about marginalization in any kind of serious way, not think about oppression or exploitation in any kind of serious way as it affects any group in the real world. I think that is a problem. And in terms of, other fields of philosophy outside of these specific kind of value theory subfields, as I said, am I going to say everybody has to center this stuff? Not necessarily, but there's lots of ways that these issues are relevant, right? To, if you're an epistemologist, it makes sense to be reading, some of the work that is coming from critical standpoints, right? It makes sense to be, and, if you're a metaphysician, right, there's bits of Marxist metaphysics. You don't have to be it'd be wonderful if you did, you don't have to be a sort of a Marx scholar, right? But there are important ways that different points of view about metaphysics have intersected with different kinds of political movements and political opinions, and have been understood to underwrite, or legitimize, different kinds of political measures. So it's it makes sense to at least have some awareness about that. You don't have to be ready to teach and write about it, but it should be something that is part of our, our background understanding of how these ideas play out in the world. I think at least that level of engagement actually, is necessary.
Thank you. We're almost running out of time. So what I'm going to do is put 3 questions together now.
Okay.
I would say that they all go under the label of Black and white relationships in different ways, whether we think of them positively or negatively as harming or helping the causes that you were talking about. One is, do you think the looting and burning of a Target, a more white targeted place, helped or harmed the Black Lives Matter movement? Well, that's that's an assessment that we'd love to hear your judgment on this. But there are, that was from Deja Boykin. Thanks, Deja. But also from Deborah London, we have 2 different questions, but again, both around this issue. She says, as a white woman, I'm tired of hearing conservative whites use people like Candace Owens as ammo for their willfully ignorant ideology. Yeah. How do you feel about Black public figures who push back against Black activism? So this relates a bit to the other one. And here is the first question. This is interesting for me, how people think of things and then relate them to other things. And she writes, Deborah London, I have taken to heart the messages that I hear about it not being the job of Black people to educate white people in the community, for instance. I do believe silence is violence, and I commonly use my voice as a white person and take up the uncomfortable subject of race amongst white people. I face less danger for speaking up than a person of color. Do you believe that pushing back against racism by speaking up against covert racism is effective? Thank you.
Yeah. These do very conveniently, sort of fit together nicely. Yeah. So I'll start with Deja Boykin's question, which is, so important for us, and it really goes to some of the themes, especially towards the end of my talk, where I talk about the inherently insurrectionary character, right, of a lot of Black rebellion and Black struggle, I'm in terms of whether it did more to help or harm the Black Lives Matter movement. I think that I need more I think we need a longer time span in order to be totally sure, but I do want to talk about some ways that I think it helped, right? So one thing that's clear is that there had been, the Black Lives Matter is nearly a decade old, at this point, and there had been protests and there had been petitions and there had been promises, right? And this had gone on and on and on and on and on. And in the year, 2020, what do we have? But, and it's not just, as everyone knows, of course, it's horrific enough that a Black person, an unarmed Black person, would be murdered for, over nothing, right? That's bad enough. But he was murdered in such a, I use the word luxurious. Like there was a real kind of enjoyment and savoring of slowly and deliberately, right? Enjoying his death, right? This real kind of like relishing of it. And so, and so that, I think that is so much of what made it stand out, right? As just like, you have to first of all imagine what Black reality is, that the reaction is like, look, it's bad enough you're murdering us all the time, right? We're already living under that level, but now you're really, like just the kind of sadistic character of that. And so and so that's what we get after all these years of rebellion and struggle, and it took, right, unrest, right? It took a movement that was willing to say, actually, you are not going to be able to continue business as usual, because business as usual is George Floyd, right, losing his life over nothing, right, for this kind of like sick enjoyment, right? And so that's one way in which I think it was a necessary kind of ingredient, and we see that with the riots of the 60s. Where even Martin Luther King famously says a riot is the language of the unheard, and so King says, look, we don't want, we don't like prefer to see this kind of a destruction, but we have to look at the causes again, right? This is why even Martin Luther King, right, who, was often considered a radical, right? Because he's saying, well, what are the causes? Let's not just stop at moralistic condemnation. Why did this happen? It's because you don't listen unless something burns down. So let's deal with that problem too, so that we can have peace, real peace, right? So whether it did more to harm or help, I think we need more of a perspective on balance, but that's a kind of defense, right? And it's a way in which it's really going to cloud our vision in order to, if we sort of double down on, well, everything that is disruptive is inherently bad, right? So this question of I guess I'll answer first the question from Deborah London about whether it's useful for white people to push back against racism and covert racism in particular. And I would say just absolutely, absolutely yes, and especially if it's being done in a way that is itself, informed by listening to Black people, right, hearing what Black people are saying, listening to those conversations, and using the fact of proximity in white spaces to inject those politics into those conversations. I think that is great. That's wonderful. But then it goes to the second question, which is, okay, so if we're listening to Black voices, that actually, that actually is like, which ones? Because there's all sorts of Black, Clarence Thomas is a Black voice. Why not him? And I think that this also speaks to the importance of thinking about how these questions come into conversation with questions of liberation for all oppressed people, right? Liberation for everybody who is deprived, who's experiencing privation, who's experiencing um, harm, who's experiencing an inability to get their needs met, and these kinds of like Candace Owens type voices, they are not the voices that are going to help liberate Black people. I think one of the things is you can tell that because they also are the voices that support all different kinds of oppression and reaction and failure to care about people's needs. And so I think the more that we think about these things, not just in terms of separate kind of siloed identity politics, but think about how these politics have the potential to contribute to a larger project of liberation, that is going to help anchor us. Yeah, I think that's a good last word. That's what
I was just going to say, instead of my tears, we can even end with a smile, but a very appreciative smile. And thank you so much for being with us. I do want to tell everybody that the recording of this event will go on the QU MyTube YouTube channel, not MyTube, YouTube channel. I will put out an announcement as soon as that's available. But for everybody who was here, and definitely those of us from philosophy and from the Department of Philosophy and Political Science, we have such a deep, deep thank you to say to you, to make you feel our gratefulness. So thank you again, Vanessa.
I do feel it. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed being together with you this afternoon, and the questions were just wonderful. And I'm really grateful for the rich discussion and for your ears for a few hours. So thank you.